So just starting off, Jake, how old are you?
30 years old.
30. So that would have made you
I was 10 years old at the time 9/11 happened. I was in the fifth grade, Mrs. Leon's class at Governor Wolf Elementary School in Bethlehem. I grew up here in Bethlehem.
okay. And what was that day like?
Um, I was kind of racking my brain before we started this to think about what kind of like the day was. One of my earliest memories, I think, of I was on the school bus at the time the planes actually did hit. It was around right before 9 o'clock, so I would have been headed into school at that time. So nobody really knew what was happening. None of the students really knew what was going on. So when we got there, I remember like the first couple of hours of school, um, a whole bunch of parents started showing up and taking their kids out of class. And it was pretty random, like who got taken and who didn't. And at first, when you're, fifth grade, 10-year-old mind, you're like, okay, well, maybe somebody's sick, maybe something's going on. I don't know. But it started to become like a habit. Like it was like 15 out of 30 kids, like 15 had left for the day. My parents, I would find out later, had made the decision to keep me at school. They thought it was the safest place for me, and I agree with that decision. Obviously everything turned out okay on that front, but um, yeah, as far as that, like I remember everybody was leaving school pretty early. Then it was around right before lunch, the principal, since we were fifth grade, we were like the top of the school, like it was the last year before, elementary graduation.
Gotcha.
The principal called us all fifth graders to an assembly, which I thought was kind of weird. I mean, usually we used to get told when there was something going on or, somebody was coming to visit. And I remember she was very serious. The look on her face was very serious. And she told us, point blank, she said, she called us kind of like the elders of the school, if you will, like since we were the fifth graders. I don't remember her exact wording, or maybe the older siblings or older brothers and sisters. I can't remember what it was. But I remember her looking very serious at us and telling us a plane crashed into the Twin Towers. That was kind of her first thing in New York. There's the Twin Towers. She kind of explained because all of us, had been there or may not have known what they were, what the World Trade Center was. So she said the Twin Towers in New York, a plane had crashed into them. We don't know too much yet. We know that they were crashed and they're completely destroyed, essentially. She asked us to remain calm, to kind of listen to our teachers, follow instructions, and that more would be coming as we knew more. She didn't tell us at first it was terrorists. She didn't tell us that it was. I don't think we all knew quite yet. And so at lunch, I remember a lot of us, it was all anybody could talk about. A lot of people thought it was some pilot that, made a mistake, that somehow had gotten rerouted over New York and had crashed into the Twin Towers by mistake. And we thought it was going to be, I don't want to say funny per se, but, like we thought it was like something like some drunk or something, to be perfectly frank. In
Yeah.
retrospect, we didn't think it would end up being what it actually ended up being. So as the day went on, that was kind of all we could talk about, and slowly more details kind of trickled in. Eventually we realized that it probably was bin Laden and Al Qaeda that was responsible. We were kind of told what that was, which, for a fifth grader, for a fifth grade mind who's just learning geography and learning how the world works, it's very strange. Not to mention like a fifth grader who, had grown up to that point to the 90s. Which I studied history in college, and commonly the 90s was known as the end of history. The Soviet Union had fallen. It was all about the space, like we were all going into space, everybody was going to be happy, incomes were up, people were working, everything was great. And all of a sudden there was this moment where all of that kind of shattered. And I think that's really kind of where I start the beginning of that. That's, there was everything that came before 9/11 and everything that came after. And it was kind of that moment at school that afternoon, as we were talking and learning more about it, that slowly that innocence of what we thought America was, of what we thought our people were, suddenly just started to kind of erode, and kind of get exposed, and our vulnerabilities too. Of course, some people in my class did have relatives that worked in New York. I recall that a lot of them were taken out of class. I don't recall that there was anyone who had died per se, but the families were pretty shaken for a couple days after, and they were out of school for quite a bit. And then when I got home that night, I mean, that was, I remember my brother and I have an older brother and sister. They were waiting on the porch for me because they were in middle school at the time over at East Hills. So they got home a little earlier than I did. And it was our neighbors had come over too, two of our neighbor kids. And we just couldn't believe it. Like it was just slowly, I mean, we pieced together more information together of what we heard. One of my friends, his dad was a paramedic who was on standby to go. I don't think he actually, I'm not sure. I can't, don't quote me. I didn't, I'm not necessarily sure if he went to New York, but I remember he was very nervous about that. But it was, I mean, all of us were pretty much, that was all we could talk about. It was all over the news. It was, a national conversation. It was also very quiet that day too, as if I recall. I remember it was the weather was very nice and it was very quiet that night, quieter than it should have been. I mean, I grew up in Bethlehem Township, so it's pretty quiet as it is, but it wasn't, I just remember an eerie silence. I mean, everybody was kind of stuck, kind of in their own thoughts, kind of in their own trying to process what had happened. And that's kind of where we were as the neighborhood kids group on the porch, was trying to process how this got. I mean, we've been told in our, in our history books that, America never loses. America wins its wars, nobody hates us, everybody, we're an exceptional country. And here we are, we just had someone, destroy the Twin Towers. It was then that I found out about the Pentagon as well, around that time when I got home, and then about the Shanksville, Pennsylvania, out west when that crashed. So then it became like, that was just the conversation then. That was just pretty much all we talked about for several months after that.
Yeah, I'm trying to pin down too, after, in the days and weeks that followed, I feel like I remember, I was in third grade at the time of 9/11. But I feel like in the weeks and months afterwards, there was even this pull towards like this, like patriotism, nationalism.
Oh,
Like,
yes.
yeah. So can you sort of like, do you remember that? Or was that anything that you felt, influenced you? I mean, at the same time, there's a lot of Islamophobia going on.
Mhm.
Anything that you saw or anything like that?
From what I remember from going back, I mean, I do remember it was actually the same summer the movie Pearl Harbor came out that this happened. Pearl Harbor had just come out after that. And I remember after George W. Bush addressed the nation, my mom was in tears because it reminded her of in the film when FDR talks about a day which will live in infamy. That was kind of like my mother's visceral reaction when she cried. It was sort of that vein. She recognized the moment, and that was sort of one of the big like nationalist moments I can think of. I also do remember Giant grocery store had been new to the area at the time, and they paid for an American flag, like little 8x10 American flag cardboard sign, to be sent in every newspaper to every house. And overnight, I mean, those were on everybody's windows. Those were on cars. They were everywhere. You saw those little giant American flags. Even houses that I didn't know, like people lived in, that had looked abandoned for several years, suddenly had a flag in the window. It was just an amazing coming together. As far as Islamophobia goes, I can't, like, I don't think there were any. I mean, I know it was in like this, like when talking to relatives and stuff. I know it was, and other people that are kind of like, in talking about it was more of like a verbal thing. I mean, people would talk about it was those people over there, the Muslims, the radicalized Islamic groups and stuff. It was very like, I mean, it wasn't, I don't think there were any outward displays as far as like attacking anybody that I remember around here anyway, that I can recall. But I do remember it became the enemy. There were signs up, people would post in their truck, wanted bin Laden, Taliban, hand him over, like all types of stuff like that, because no one knew where he was at the time, or he was in hiding. That was kind of like the national enemy all of a sudden. But yeah, I can't say that I'm not sure if it's just coming from a place of privilege, or where I'm, as far as here, maybe the people of the Lehigh Valley, I don't know, didn't quite comprehend yet. But I do remember it was, a lot of, we're going to get bin Laden, we're going to get the people responsible for this. Everybody put up your flag, Yeah,
absolutely. I asked that because I was talking to my husband about this project, and he's white, and when I really asked him to like sit back and reflect, and I was like, well, what did you see after 9/11? And he was in New Jersey, and he sort of marked that as the first time that he really saw like racism in
Mm.
his family practicing racism, people around him, you know, just really seeing it for the first time as a young kid, like, oh wow, we're not liking these people because of what they look like. So I think that's a very interesting question to ask, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I did talk to a lot of people, or a few people in the Lehigh Valley who had moved from, I guess, more predominantly white areas in the country to the Lehigh Valley. And, you know, the Lehigh Valley is just so diverse that it was like, no, I didn't really see any of that in the Lehigh Valley. So I just, you know,
Yeah.
um, yeah, so what do you think? So I didn't know. So you studied history in college?
I
What
did.
did you do?
History and political science.
Nice. Did 9/11 influence that decision to do that at all, or no? If not, that's okay.
I mean, I always was kind of interested in it,
Mhm.
as far as history, but it definitely, I mean, definitely did make it more interesting. Now that we kind of got to the, now that actual history was kind of happening around me. I think that definitely, I mean, that did play a role. I mean, current events suddenly shifted pretty dramatically. The eyes were suddenly on the Islamic world and, what was going on in the Middle East, more so than, I mean, they always kind of had been in the 90s, but not to the extent they were now. I mean, suddenly everybody knew where Afghanistan was. Suddenly everybody was looking at Iraq. I mean, once President Bush had pushed us in that direction, and Iran, like suddenly we were all learning kind of the geography collectively of, a region we really didn't know too well, or a region that really wasn't, high on anyone's, priority. I mean, everybody could kind of point out, where the UK is on a map or where Italy is on a map, but nobody really kind of knew the countries in the Middle East. And it kind of forced us to awaken to what was going on in that region, to focus more on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Thinking back during that time and after, I mean, I think that a lot of like I've been looking at some like Pew Research studies on millennials, and it's very interesting to hear like I don't know the ages of the authors, but it's interesting to read reports about my generation from people that are probably boomers. I
Mm.
think is very interesting. Um, but talking about how the politics of a generation could have shifted because of 9/11 and being through a terrorist attack like this. And not that I'm trying to get too much into politics with you, I'm not trying to make this a political story, but
Mhm.
you think that it influenced you when you became of age to vote? Either way, doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think it does, like, as far as voting, like I tend to go toward like domestic policies. But I mean, it always has been a consideration. I mean, like in 2004, I remember, I mean, I was still not eligible to vote yet, but that was a big consideration, was who was going to keep us safe, was the big thing. And I do know that's when, by 2008, then the Islamophobia had started to come out, and, people were like, oh, Barack Obama's middle name is Hussein, he's not going to keep us safe. That always seemed to be like one of the guiding issues as far as like national security and foreign policy, was like, I think prior to 9/11, that wasn't so much on people's, from what I remember. I mean, again, I'm going back, I was 10 years old at the time, so I wasn't really a political analyst or pundit when I was, 8 years old or whatever, or 6 when Clinton first got in.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, it wasn't so, we didn't really think of other countries or like of safety. I would say that never really was something that registered on like either my, discussions with family or discussions in the school about elections. Like, we always kind of assumed that we were the best military on earth. We were the strongest nation economically. We were, America was, America. It was going to take care of itself. We were coming from a place of the top of the unilateral top of the world. Um, and I think that really changed after 9/11. As suddenly it became a big concern about, say, who was going to keep us safe, and who was the safest candidate to go for. And I mean, sometimes that led to fabrications, that led to some candidates saying to other candidates, well, you don't support spending on defense, or a huge defense budget, you're not going to keep us safe. I'm not sure how much that necessarily registered with the millennials. I mean, a lot of us now, I think, mostly because of the economy. I mean, the Great Recession eventually would kind of trump that safety, small t Trump, would kind of trump that safety consideration. I think more of us were concerned about the economic net, of what would eventually happen as we got off to college and into careers, because the economy was just tanking. I graduated in 2009, and that was right after the housing crisis that happened, and it was just, that was kind of on everybody's mind, was, what were we going to do now? Like, what comes after the recession? We've been over this again. And then eventually that event translated into other crises that eventually got us into, I mean, COVID-19 down the road. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the safety was always part of the consideration as far as elections goes, to go back to the original question. And I feel like slowly we've shifted away from that. I don't think it gets as visceral of a reaction as it used to. Like, I think it used to get like at the 2001 to 2008, probably it got the most issue saliency, the most drive out of people to go vote, and the most consideration. But I would say after the Great Recession and everything that followed with that, I think, as far as like talking to other millennials, I think college debt got out of control. The housing market's completely out of control. Everything else, as far as starting our lives as adults, a lot of people feel like, a lot of my friends, at least, for a lot of that, post 2008 world, were like, when am I going to become an adult? When am I going to actually, be a grown up? When am I adulting? Because I'm still living at home, or I'm still, paying off college debt, or I can't afford a house, I can't afford a mortgage. I think that kind of became more of the consideration for millennials, at least from my perspective. But again, I mean, I feel like safety is somehow always on the, as far as the stove of the burner issues, it's either on the back burner or it's close to, it's always like a consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes perfect sense. One thing, so I was looking back, so did you guys in school that day on 9/11, did you guys watch the news on TV? Like, did you see, because one thing that I really wanted to talk about was this idea of maybe not necessarily PTSD, but there are studies coming out now when if you see like an attack or something traumatic happening in real time on TV, how that can sort of hold you and be brought up again and again.
I don't recall us actually watching it that day.
Okay.
In the actual school building. I do know once I got home, it was on every TV in my parents' house. My brother and sister were tuned in. I was tuned in. I remember eating dinner that night, and that's all we talked about. We had, radio news on during dinner, because they still had that. We still had that.
Nice.
It was like, yeah, it was, I mean, that was kind of the big talk, was just, it was everywhere then when I got home. So I wouldn't say that I had like I don't want to minimize trauma or anything. I wouldn't say that I had it personally, or that I
Gotcha.
experienced it that day. I mean, it always was kind of a consideration. And I mean, safety always kind of became a concern after that. But I wouldn't say that it translated into any sort of like life disrupting, I don't know. I want to use that because I don't want to like minimize trauma or anything. Like, it didn't turn into any. I didn't feel any negative effects from it, I guess I should say, personally.
Gotcha.
In my
Nothing like negative and recurring or anything like that.
Nothing recurring, no, nightmares or anything, like any reactions of that sort, any like
Yeah,
reactions. So
absolutely. And that's okay. That's okay. Um,
yeah,
what
not
about,
to say that I felt like totally positive and safe, but at the
yeah.
same time too, it was, I mean, it was, there was a little bit of hesitancy to get on planes after that, and to,
Mhm.
air travel. There was always, even in the airport now, maybe, this might be a sign of that. There's still a little bit of me that always kind of wonders, is security really that secure? Am I gonna, is there somebody on my flight that could, cause us harm? I mean, I feel like maybe that kind of translated a little bit more as I grew up. Like, there's always kind of that consideration that this, hijacking was from what I, from the way that the narrative was kind of laid out, was kind of easy. and how they were able to pull this off with all we had, like as far as in place. Like, I mean, granted, it wasn't as uh inclusive, or as as large a national security and getting on a plane wasn't as hard in 2001 as it was afterwards.
Mhm.
But still, I mean, it always did remain a consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. What about, because we're so close geographically to New York City here in Pennsylvania, any perspective change on like New York or going to the city? Like, had you been there before that? Did it suddenly not feel safe anymore or anything like that?
Um, well, I remember I was there prior to 9/11. I think we
Okay.
went to go see Beauty and the Beast on Broadway when I was in about second or third grade. So that was kind of an experience. I do remember seeing the Twin Towers and driving by them, and that was always like one of the most recognizable parts of the New York skyline.
Mm.
And going in was always, if you could see the Twin Towers first, that was like the one of the big. There was the Empire State Building, and there was the Twin Towers. Those were like the two things you had to see when you were going in. Um, like over the bridge and through the tunnels and such, and once you got into Manhattan. As far as going into the city afterwards, I don't recall going there a lot in middle school. I think they tried to steer us a little bit away from going to either Broadway or to museums or to different things. Um, I don't recall us going there again until, oh geez, it would have to have been in high school. There was like trips to New York again. Um, but yeah, it wasn't for a couple of years there. It was kind of seen as not the safest place to be. Granted, too, we were coming off the 90s as well, and that was, Rudy Giuliani, and we still had, the a lot of the tough on crime rhetoric was still around. So if it wasn't, a building that was going to collapse because of a plane and because of terrorist hijackers, it was a pickpocket or somebody was going to mug you. That was the other common thing around here. And then kind of in high school, that's when things sort of started to turn around a little bit, and people started to go more frequently to New York, in school and outside of school, and we were like, hey, maybe that's not so true after all. But at the time, that was always the big thing then.
Yeah, absolutely. With that whole broken windows policing sort of.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh yes.
absolutely. Um, so how does it feel now? I think it's so interesting looking at our generation like living through this, and now it's like the kids these days, those whippersnappers, they're learning about this in a history book where
Yeah.
we lived through it. How does it feel to reflect on how many, like, 2 decades have passed and we have a whole nother generation coming in and learning about this secondhand?
Yeah. It's interesting because it feels like it feels both further away and not far at all, because like when I was thinking about the memories of it, I mean, time kind of stopped, so I can go back to, like, I can remember like the people that left the classroom that day. I can remember like the principal's words to us at the assembly. I can remember, people talking about the jokes that it was some sort of trick pilot who messed up and crashed into the towers by accident. I can remember all that stuff, and I can remember the conversations that came after, and watching the news, and the coverage of it. I can remember all of that. But like, it's just, having some distance though, I got to think it's been, 20 years at the same time too. I mean, so much has, it was like one of those generation defining moments, but at the same time too, so much has moved on. So much has changed, and yet so much has stayed the same. It's a very strange kind of paradox to look at, that, we've moved on a lot from it, but there's still a lot of raw emotion around the topic, and a lot of things we can specifically recall from that day. And from what followed. I think it's a little of both. I would say it's both. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Um, a little, a little of we can never forget it, and we can always remember it, but a little of there's been some distance, and some things have changed for sure. And I mean, I have nieces who are in preschool and a nephew who's in preschool, and so far they haven't asked about it yet, or they haven't learned about it, but I know that day's coming. And I mean, I'm mindful of that. I'm mindful of that. We'll have to explain what the world was like at the time, what we were thinking at the time, how we were going, especially too now with what's going on in Afghanistan and the Taliban coming back into power. I mean, we're going to have to we're going to have to explain that, why we went there in the first place, what the goal was, why the mission went the way it did, the politics that were surrounding Afghanistan, the politics that surrounded the invasion of Iraq. Like we're kind of answerable to that. I mean, there's nothing really that we could have done, but it's always going to be something I think that's kind of on our generation's radar, at least from a foreign policy perspective. If that's kind of our big, what was, the national dialogue was counterterrorism and what was happening in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, I have a niece and nephew as well, and they're right before preschool age. I think they're like 2 and 4. And I was thinking about this project, and I was like, man, she just learned how to do rock paper scissors.
yeah,
Like scissors every time, because she doesn't get it. So I'm like,
Mhm.
they're gonna be growing up and learning about these things too.
Yep.
Makes me feel small in comparison to that whole like
Yeah,
national event that was collectively traumatizing in
yeah.
the whole nation.
And it's weird too, because I think, I used to ask my grandparents grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. And I used to ask them about what that was like. And like it's strange because they look back on the era with so many perspectives, or I mean, they've all been since deceased. But I mean, they looked back on the era with so many different perspectives and so many different, I mean, it depended on what day you asked, like what they were thinking about, and so like, for instance, at Thanksgiving, I remember my grandmothers, they would want to keep everything we possibly could because, back in those days, they weren't sure where food was coming from. And,
Mhm.
you had to eat, everything on your plate because if you didn't, you were going to go hungry. We weren't sure where the next meal was, and kind of that kind of trauma kind of snuck in like into my growing up from their experience. Um, I always wonder what's going to sneak in from my experience. Is it going to be like getting on a plane or something, being a little nervous to do so, or going through being nervous at airline security, or, is it going to, I'm not sure what that'll look like. I'm not sure what that'll look like as far as or going to New York and seeing that, or, seeing pictures of Manhattan in those days and trying to explain what was there and what happened. I'm not sure what that's going to look like yet, but I'm thinking it's going to be somewhere along that model where there'll be ways I can speak about it like intellectually and speak about it. Oh, this is what I remember. This is what I knew. And ways that I can speak about it kind of viscerally, kind of like I have a gut reaction to, getting slightly more nervous, getting on a plane, or getting slightly more nervous in a subway or something, I think there will be some sort of visceral reaction that I think eventually the younger generations will catch up on with us and will start to notice with us.
That's a great point.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that's a great point. I mean, I didn't even think about my grandparents as well, grew up during the Depression. And yeah, I never really noticed that. I think that's a great point to make because
Yeah,
I had a similar experience with my grandparents. Like it was that, eat all your food on your plate or just sit there until it's
yeah.
done. Um, Interesting.
And then with World War II, when there was like the rationing of like butter and of like sugar and stuff, they only used like, my grandmother would put like a little like square of butter on her like toast or whatever in the morning and just put a little bit. She always used like a very little bit of everything. I remember from like when she would eat breakfast. And I would always think to myself, like, why not, we have a lot of butter, lather it up, do what you got to do, and
Yeah.
it was always like, no, we have to save what we have. We have to save what we have was always kind of the mentality of that generation. So
Yeah.
again, I'm not sure what that looks like with us as far as, I mean, I think part of it is rule following. I had noticed I am more of a, I don't know, like it always kind of gets weird when I see like one of those, I mean, I'll use the internet term, one of the Karens, going off on a salesperson or on like somebody who's like a flight attendant or something because, they're slightly inconvenienced. Like I feel like with us, like you don't see the millennials do that much. Like we know that I think we're very rules oriented as far as that goes, as far as keeping everyone safe. I mean, we're not the type to push the boundaries of the rules. We're more, in focus. We're like, okay, well, we know these were designed to keep us safe. The rules of as far as, everything from going on a carnival ride to getting on a plane, we know keep your hands, feet in the vehicle, listen to the flight attendant's instructions at the beginning. I feel like we're going to be very good at that. We're very good at the rules of the game as opposed to pushing boundaries or, the I deserve this because I'm your customer kind of thing. Like when there are rules, we'll follow them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point too. I had never noticed that. But that's true. I can see that in my life too. Interesting. Oh man, I love learning new things. Oh man, it's 8:30. Do I have time for one last question?
Sure.
Okay, cool. There's just one quick one. I'm asking everyone if there's anything specific they do to mark the day of 9/11. I know a lot of times communities will have flag raisings or firefighters will be out, having breakfast at places. Just wondering if there's anything you or your family do specifically to mark the day. If not, not a big deal. Just wanted to ask.
Um, I wouldn't say there's anything specific we do as far as like ceremony or anything specific we attend. I know over the course of the 20 years that have gone by since, I have gone to, like, if there's been like an event, whether I was at college or at school, like I would go to that. I know wearing red, white, and blue is always a thing. Like we always try to remember it with wearing the patriotic colors that day. But again, I mean, like outside of talking about it or or remembering what the day meant to us, we don't really have any formal ceremony we do or anything really to mark the day. But I mean, it always is kind of in our consciousness.
Yeah.
We always are pretty intentional about making sure we remember what the day was and what happened.
Absolutely. And I wanted to, sorry, I lied. One last question.
Oh no, go on.
Do you mind if I ask what you do now? You studied history in college. What do you do?
Yes, I actually am a legislative assistant to Senator Boscola.
Okay,
So I work in her
perfect.
district office. And I think part of 9/11 is what inspired me to get into public service.
Yeah.
I always kind of, my father was in it. He worked for the county, for Northampton County. And I kind of always had that, like after 9/11, I felt like I really had that calling to help other people. That day we saw a lot of people helping people to perfect strangers, firefighters, first responders, coming in and saving people and helping people. And I never was really in like the physical fitness as I was. I mean, I live with asthma. So I never was really in like the physical fitness to join the military or to be a first responder. So
Mhm.
kind of what kind of guided me was I was going to try to help people as much as I could in whatever capacity I could. And that's kind of what led me to eventually go into the legislature and then eventually to work with constituents like I do now.
Awesome. Thank you. It's so interesting to look at because I don't know. I feel like in the minds of the older generations, where millennials are just still these young kids, you know what I mean? These young kids farting around. And it's
We
like,
don't care. Yeah.
yeah, we are your young professionals right now. We are the ones, driving the economy and working. And it's I think it's so important to really look back and have a story like this as a part of the record.
Mhm.
And so then in like 50 years or 100 years, who knows, maybe someone will be looking up this newspaper article and be like, okay, that's how it was 20 years after,
Yeah.
and that's how people felt about it and how it shaped them growing up.